I want you to look at a photograph taken in the late 19th century, deep in the mountains of the American West. At first glance, your eyes might not even process what you are seeing. A canyon carved by thousands of years of rushing water drops away into black shadow. The walls are sheer, jagged rock, and spanning this absolute void, connecting one impossible cliff to another, is a spiderweb of raw, towering timber. If you look very closely at the top of the frame, you will see a train sitting on the tracks. And right beside it, looking like grains of sand against the massive scale of the structure, are the men who built it. The logs making up the vertical supports are the width of a man's height. The structure rises over 150 feet from the canyon floor, and it is entirely made of wood. Now, the question that should immediately trouble anyone looking at this image is not why they built it, but how they lifted it. In the era when this photograph was taken, there were no diesel engines, there were no hydraulic cranes, there were no paved roads leading down to the bottom of the gorge to allow heavy lifting machinery to operate from below. Every single piece of that massive intertwining wooden puzzle, weighing tens of thousands of pounds, had to be moved, positioned, and secured in midair. When you stare at the sheer physical reality of what they achieved, you are forced into a corner. Either these men possessed a mechanical lifting technology that we have entirely forgotten, or they understood the physics of wood, weight, and gravity in a way that we simply cannot replicate today. Did they build machines that were lost to time? Or did they possess a method of engineering so intimately tied to the landscape that it evaporated the moment the modern era arrived? We are going to look at the official engineering reports from the time, at the few surviving photographs that accidentally captured the construction process, at the brutal physical limitations of the canyons themselves, and at the quiet, almost deliberate erasure of an entire branch of human knowledge. To understand how they achieved the impossible, you first have to understand what they did not have, and the world they were forced to operate in. The era following the gold rush and the subsequent explosion of railroad expansion across the North American continent was driven by a single, ruthless imperative. They had to move forward. The economy of the time was expanding at a pace that defied logic, driven by the extraction of gold, silver, coal, and timber. To move these heavy resources, they needed trains. But trains are inherently fragile machines when it comes to geography. A train cannot climb a steep mountain grade. It cannot navigate a sharp, sudden curve. A train must travel on a relatively flat, straight plane. When a railroad crew building a line through the Sierra Nevada or the Cascade Mountains encountered a canyon that was 200 feet wide and 150 feet deep, they could not go down into it, and they could not go around it. They had to go straight across it. Today, we would bring in convoys of heavy trucks, pour thousands of tons of reinforced concrete, and erect steel pillars using massive hydraulic cranes. But in the 1870s and 1880s, the foundries that produced iron and steel were located thousands of miles away on the eastern seaboard. Iron was incredibly expensive, and more importantly, it was tremendously heavy. You could not easily haul massive iron bridge components over unpaved, muddy mountain passes using teams of horses or oxen. The logistics of steel were simply out of reach for many of these remote western valleys. But the engineers and the railroad barons had one resource available in absolute abundance right where they stood: the forest. The canyons were surrounded by ancient old-growth timber: Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and coastal redwood. These were not the spindly trees we often see in commercial forests today. These were giants. A single raw log, freshly felled and still wet with sap, could weigh 10,000 pounds or more. The wood was dense, flexible, and capable of bearing immense compressive loads. The men who came to tame this landscape were not university-educated theoretical engineers sitting in clean offices. They were pragmatists. They were former shipwrights, deep woods loggers, and miners who understood the mechanical properties of timber in their bones. They knew how a tree would splinter under pressure, how it would warp as it dried, and how to shape it with broad axes and adzes. We tend to picture people of that age as simple, relying purely on brute force and primitive tools. But the individuals who planned these crossings were practical mathematicians and kinetic engineers, working with a level of precision that still holds up under modern scrutiny. They were tasked with building structures capable of supporting a locomotive weighing over 80 tons, pulling a train of loaded cars, vibrating and swaying violently as it crossed a gap suspended high in the air. And they had to do it using only hand tools, hemp rope, raw muscle, and the timber they cut from the surrounding hills. If you enjoy stories the history books quietly skipped, consider subscribing, because this channel lives on them. We are going to look at what the official engineering manuals actually say about how this was done, at the physical evidence of the lifting mechanics that were accidentally caught on camera, at why the accepted explanations leave so much unexplained, and at the deeply unsettling realization of how easily a massive body of human brilliance can be completely wiped from our collective memory. So, how do you bridge a gap that wide and that deep without a crane? The official engineering explanation, the one you will find in the textbooks that catalog the history of the railroads, points to a structural design known as the timber trestle, and specifically, the bent system. A trestle bridge is not a single spanning arch. It is a series of relatively short spans supported by tall, vertical frameworks called bents. If you look at the photographs, the bents are the massive A-shaped wooden towers standing up from the canyon floor. They are wider at the base to provide stability against the wind and the lateral force of the moving trains, and they taper as they rise. They are tied together with a complex web of diagonal cross-bracing. According to the standard historical record, these bents were assembled flat on the ground. Teams of men, using precise measurements, would cut the massive logs, shape the ends into interlocking mortise and tenon joints, and pin them together using large wooden dowels, or later, heavy iron bolts. They would construct an entire vertical section lying flat. Now comes the critical moment. You have a wooden framework that is 50 feet wide at the base, 150 feet tall, weighing perhaps 40 to 60 tons. It is lying flat on the floor of a rocky, uneven gorge. You need to stand it perfectly upright. The textbooks tell us they used a gin pole and a block and tackle. A gin pole is essentially a tall, thick mast erected near the lifting site, held securely in place by guy ropes anchored to the surrounding rocks or trees. It acts as a high pivot point. A block and tackle is a system of pulleys. By running a thick hemp rope through multiple pulleys attached to the top of the gin pole and the top of the wooden bent, you multiply the pulling force. The ropes are run down to the ground, where they are hitched to teams of horses, mules, or dozens of men turning a massive wooden winch called a capstan. The men push, the horses pull, the ropes groan, and slowly the massive 60-ton wooden frame swings up from the ground until it stands vertical. Once upright, it is braced, secured, and the process is repeated for the next bent 15 or 20 feet away. Then, horizontal beams called stringers are laid across the top to connect them, and the rails are placed on top. This is the official explanation. It is clean, it is logical, and for a long time it's satisfied most historians. But look at the photographs again. Look at the sheer, terrifying reality of the environment. The textbook explanation sounds perfectly reasonable if you are raising a barn in a flat, grassy meadow on a calm summer day. But these men were not in a meadow. They were standing on the uneven, slippery, boulder-strewn floor of a V-shaped canyon, with a river raging through the middle of it. If you assemble a 150-foot, 60-ton wooden frame flat on the ground, where exactly do you put it? The canyon walls are often too steep to lay it out. Furthermore, consider the physics of the lift. As the frame rises, it catches the wind. At 100 feet in the air, a gust of wind blowing down the canyon acts on that massive wooden lattice like a sail. The lateral forces would be astronomical. If the frame twists even a few degrees out of plumb while suspended by hemp ropes, the shifting weight would tear the gin pole right out of its bedrock anchors. The ropes themselves, thick enough to hold that kind of weight, would be so heavy that just dragging them into position would take a team of men. The margin for error is exactly 0. If a rope snaps or an anchor point gives way, 60 tons of timber comes crashing down, splintering into shrapnel and killing everyone below. And the surviving records show that while accidents did happen, these bridges were built with astonishing speed. Sometimes, a massive trestle was completed in a matter of weeks. Doing this incredibly dangerous, mathematically terrifying lift once is a miracle of human endurance. Doing it 50 times in a row, perfectly aligned so that a train can roll over the finished deck without the bridge buckling, borders on the impossible. The official explanation simply leaves too much unexplained. The math feels off. The logistics of the canyon floor contradict the neat diagrams of the textbooks. Every time investigators and modern structural engineers try to close the book on this case by pointing to simple ropes and pulleys, the physical reality of the photographs pulls the question back open. There had to be something else. A missing piece of the process that the completion photographs did not capture. For decades, the mystery lingered in the background of historical engineering. The completed photographs were celebrated as triumphs of the pioneering spirit, but the mechanics were glossed over. But there was something no one had fully checked yet. While thousands of photographs exist showing the grand opening of these bridges, with locomotives proudly steaming across them, photographs of the actual day-to-day construction phase are incredibly rare. Photography in the late 19th century was not a casual endeavor. It required heavy wooden cameras, fragile glass plates, and volatile chemicals. Photographers typically only made the difficult trek into the mountains when the bridge was finished and ready for the press. But a few construction photos do exist. They sat misfiled in regional archives or in the private collections of railroad descendants. And when someone finally pulled them out and looked closely at the blurred, active edges of the frame, the whole case changed shape. Because in these rare images, you do not just see a bridge being built from the ground up. You see a structure sitting on top of the structure. This is the moment the official explanation begins to unravel. And a much more brilliant reality takes its place. The men were not fighting the canyon. They were using the bridge to conquer the canyon. The missing piece of the puzzle is a piece of lost technology known as the traveler crane, or sometimes simply the false work. Look at the construction photograph. At the very edge of the completed bridge deck, jutting out terrifyingly into the empty air over the gorge, is a massive secondary wooden framework. It looks like a heavy, boxy tower on wheels, sitting on the newly laid rails. This was the traveler. It was a crane made almost entirely of timber, designed to be counterweighted at the back with tons of iron rails or stone, allowing its long wooden arms to reach far out into the void without tipping over. The men did not assemble the massive bints on the impossible canyon floor and drag them upright. That was the myth. Instead, they built the bridge from the top down, piece by vertical piece. The traveler crane rolled to the edge of the abyss. From its overhanging arms, cables were lowered. They would lower the bottom sections of the vertical posts, suspend them in the air, and men hanging from ropes would pin the cross bracing into place while dangling 100 feet above the river. Once a section was secure, they lowered the next section on top of it. They built the massive A-frames vertically, joining mortise and tenon in midair, guided by the steady lowering power of the traveler above. And what was powering this massive wooden machine? If you trace the blurred lines of the thick cables running back from the traveler, they do not go to teams of exhausted horses. They disappear into the tree line, where another forgotten piece of the era sits quietly smoking. The steam donkey, a stationary steam engine anchored immovably to a massive old-growth stump. The steam donkey was a boiler and a mechanized winch. It provided relentless, untiring, smooth pulling power. The operator, known as the donkey puncher, controlled the tension with absolute precision, guided by a complex system of whistle signals from the men suspended out on the timber. Now put the pieces together. The legend of men wrestling 60-ton frames from the ground using pure muscle is replaced by something far more sophisticated. The steam donkey provided the industrial muscle. The traveler crane provided the overhanging reach and the mechanical advantage. The timbermen provided the spatial genius. They created a recursive engineering loop. They built a section of the bridge, laid the track, rolled the traveler crane forward onto the new section, and used it to build the next section. The bridge carried the machine that built the bridge. This changes everything. It means the knowledge did not rely on brute force. It relied on a highly advanced, specialized system of mobile construction. But if you think this solves the mystery, it actually creates a deeper one. Line it up with the scale of what they achieved, the precision, the ability to align massive, raw logs in mid-air, the identical, flawless execution across hundreds of distinct sites. It was never the work of isolated, desperate improvisation. It was a refined system, a masterclass in timber physics, something that was taught, perfected, and implemented on a massive scale. So the question narrows to one possibility that historians resisted for decades. If this system was so brilliant, so perfectly adapted to its environment, and so devastatingly effective, why is there no trace of it in modern construction? Why couldn't we replicate this today with the same materials? How does an entire body of practical engineering knowledge simply disappear without a trace? So, here, at last, is what the evidence tells us. Both the answer to how they achieved the impossible and the answer to why it was allowed to vanish entirely turn out to be the exact same story. The method was never magic, and it was never impossible. It was a closed ecosystem of supreme, specialized knowledge. The men who designed and operated the traveler cranes, the men who knew exactly how far a green fir log would bend before it shattered, the men who could listen to the groan of a hemp rope and know if it was about to snap. They possessed a profound mastery of their materials. But that mastery was an oral and kinetic tradition. It was knowledge that lived in the hands, in the eyes, and in the muscle memory of the workers. It was passed from a master bridger to his apprentices on the job site. You could not learn this from a book, and the railroad companies did not waste time writing down the minute daily adjustments required to build a traveler crane. They only cared about the schedule and the cost. And that is exactly why the knowledge was so fragile. Knowledge that lives exclusively in people, not in stone or detailed blueprints, dies with the people who carry it. The timber trestle bridges were brilliant, but they had three fatal flaws that the modernizing world could not tolerate. First, wood rots, especially when subjected to the constant vibration of heavy trains. Second, the bridges were highly susceptible to the elements. A sudden mountain flood could wash out the footings. But the third and most devastating flaw was fire. In the era of the steam locomotive, trains spewed burning cinders from their smokestacks. A single hot cinder landing on a dry, resin-soaked timber could ignite a conflagration that would consume a month of impossible labor in a matter of hours. The railroad companies hired men whose sole job was to walk the tracks after a train passed, looking for smoldering embers. But it was a losing battle. And then, the world shifted. The foundries in the East multiplied. The cost of manufacturing and transporting steel dropped drastically. Steel was standardized. A steel beam forged in Pennsylvania possessed the exact same tensile strength as a steel beam forged in Ohio. You did not need a master timberman to read the grain of a steel beam. You just needed an engineer to run the mathematical formulas. Steel did not rot, and steel did not burn. The transition was brutal and absolute. The railroad companies simply stopped ordering timber trestles. They ordered steel viaducts. The master timbermen suddenly found themselves without contracts. The massive wooden traveler cranes were disassembled or left to rot on sidings. The steam donkeys were abandoned in the encroaching forests, their boilers rusting into dust. The old masters retired, and the young apprentices, seeing which way the wind was blowing, went to the cities to learn how to rivet steel. The chain of transmission was severed. Suddenly, in a single generation, spanning roughly from 1890 to 1920, the accumulated mastery of giant timber engineering was cut off. The system was abandoned not because it failed, but because the economic rules of the world had changed. We may never recover every step of the process. We will never truly know the specific whistle codes they used to lower a 10-ton log into a mortise joint while suspended in a canyon crosswind. But we now understand enough to say with absolute confidence that this was advanced engineering. It was not a myth, it was not an exaggeration, and it was not a lucky accident. Which means the people we so often look back on and picture as primitive were, in this specific environment, far ahead of us. They solved the problem using organic materials that we would still find intensely difficult today, even with computer modeling. And then history, obsessed with the triumph of steel, simply forgot to write their names down. We like to think that human knowledge only moves forward. We are taught to believe that progress is a straight, unbreakable line leading upwards, and that because we possess digital technology and massive hydraulic machines, we are inherently more capable than the generations that preceded us. But the forgotten timber trestles of the American West are undeniable proof that knowledge does not always survive. Entire skills, refined over centuries of trial, error, and human blood, can vanish in a single lifetime. It happens the moment a society decides that a specific skill is no longer economically useful. We look at the sepia photographs today and see an impossible puzzle, but the puzzle only exists because we let the instructions slip through our fingers. Everything you know how to do, the foundation of our entire modern civilization, exists only because someone made the conscious choice to pass it on. The moment they stop, it is gone. Those staggering wooden structures spanning the dark canyons were a monument to exactly that, to the quiet, unyielding brilliance of human hands, and to the terrifying fragility of human memory. An empire can rise and fall, and still leave less behind than a single profound idea passed from one careful hand to the next. Remember that photograph we started with? The one detail of the tiny men standing over the abyss that no one could immediately explain. Look at it again in your mind now. It is no longer just a picture of a primitive bridge. It is a measure of exactly how far ahead these people really were, and a warning that what we consider permanent today can evaporate tomorrow. I really do want to hear your answer to this, because the comments under these videos are half the reason I make them. What knowledge do you think we are quietly losing right now without even noticing, simply because we rely on a newer technology to do the thinking for us? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely read them and think about them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones the history books quietly skipped over because they didn't fit the neat narrative of progress, then subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next one, and I promise you, there are stranger investigations coming. If this deep dive kept you here to the end, a like genuinely helps more people find the channel. That is not a small thing. It is the whole reason independent historical research like this can survive in a noisy world. Thank you for staying with me all the way through, for looking past the obvious answers, and for keeping the question open. Keep asking why the quiet places are quiet. I will see you in the next one.